Today we will learn and reflect on the opening chapters of the History of Herodotus, which covers the events leading up to the Greco-Persian Wars, where the greatly outnumbered Greek city-states successfully defended themselves against the mighty Persian Empire. Not only does Herodotus discuss the history of the Persian expansion in Egypt, Greek Ionia, and Scythia, and the rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great and the usurper King Darius, both who are also mentioned in the Old Testament, but Herodotus also treats us to travelogues and told stories from Egypt and Scythia. So why did Herodotus write his histories? Herodotus tells us in his first paragraph, he wrote his history so that human achievements may not be forgotten in time, and great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by Greeks, some by barbarians, may not be without their glory, and especially to show why the two peoples fought with each other. At the end of our talk, we will discuss the sources we use for this video and additional lessons we can learn from these sources, and my blogs that cover the topic. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. Herodotus reflects on the themes seen in the Iliad as the Greeks seek to transcend their warrior culture to a more civilized culture. In the warrior cultures of ancient Greece and the Old Testament, warfare meant for the losing side, often the men would be massacred and women and children would be enslaved, and for women this meant that they would be concubines of the conquerors. And the lesson in the Iliad and many other Greek classics is avoid hubris, lest you snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Also, the Oracle at Delphi and many other Greek works, know thyself, know your limitations, and be open to wise counsel. You gain immortality and glory through your heroism on and off the battlefield. Herodotus was born and grew up in Halicarnassus, a Greek city on the Mediterranean coast in Asia Minor, before the time of the Greco-Persian Wars. In his youth, he was welcomed to live in Athens, and often he championed an Athenian viewpoint, and later in life he moved to an Athenian colony in Italy. Many scholars say he lived during the first few years of the Peloponnesian Wars, fought between the allies of Athens and Sparta. The Greek cities in Ionia, along the coast of Asia Minor or modern Turkey, were under Persian rule during the Greco-Persian Wars. As you can see from the dates, Herodotus was a few decades older than Thucydides, who wrote the main history about the Peloponnesian War. These two wars also were about 2 decades apart. Who knows? Maybe Herodotus and Thucydides were acquaintances. Thucydides started writing an excellent history of the Peloponnesian War, literally stopping in the middle of the page in the middle of a sentence, and Xenophon finished chronicling the war from that point. And a century after this war, Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire and kept on going, as he and his father, King Philip of Macedon, learned the lessons from these wars that Persia was ripe for the taking. And looking at the wars, the Trojan Wars, when gods still mingled with humans, were about 8 centuries prior to the Greco-Persian Wars. The known world was much smaller in the ancient world. The map reconstructed from the descriptions of Hecataetus, the ethnographer whose works Herodotus mentions, show a map that Putin would like, because the Black Sea is much more than just a Russian lake. To the ancient Greeks, the Black Sea was the center of the world. Herodotus did not believe the land areas were round, though the map suggests this. He thought the boundaries were irregular, but he was not certain that the large river, named Ocean, even existed, because in Greece nobody had ever sailed in the river Ocean. Now, the Phoenicians may have circumnavigated Africa, but nobody near Greece had any idea what was in the northern reaches of Europe, or the farthest reaches of Asia, or the southernmost regions of Africa, and Libya was synonymous with Africa in those days. The main battles of the war were all fought in Greece, though many Greek cities in Asia Minor fought for their independence, and many succeeded after the Persian defeats in Greece. Roughly, the last 4 books cover the Greco-Persian Wars themselves. The 5th book covers the initial, mostly unsuccessful Greek Ionian revolts, and the first 4 books include both a history and sociological and ethnological observations of Persia, Scythia, and Egypt before the war. The Scythians lived as nomads in the steppe north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea that the Persians under King Darius tried unsuccessfully to add to his empire. The Greeks saw it as a semi-mythic place at the ends of the earth, peopled by many fantastic men and animals. The Persians could never subdue them, and since the Scythians were nomads, there were no cities the Persians could conquer. The Scythians retreated rather than fight openly, drawing the Persians further and further into unknown lands, harassing them in raiding parties, until the Persians had to withdraw when they were running low on supplies. Many scholars debate, well, was Herodotus the father of history or the father of lies? Scholars debate this question, but we do know for sure that his history is the primary source for the history of the Greco-Persian Wars, like it or not. The unlikely victory of the quarreling Greek city-states over the mighty Persian Empire set the stage for the decades-long Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Sparta. And both these events formed the political background for the trial and execution of Socrates and all of the Platonic dialogues, which formed the basis for the Western philosophical and political traditions. And not to mention, had Persia won these wars, our Western philosophical and political tradition would have been much different. Now, the scholar J. Bury lists these three maxims of historical criticism used by Herodotus. Number 1, suspect superhuman and miraculous occurrences, but portents, oracles, and dreams are acceptable. And Herodotus will retell mythic stories from the distant past, often as if they were history. Now, the oracle at Delphi has a special place in histories written by both Herodotus and Thucydides. The oracle was consulted multiple times in both these wars, and was consulted by a companion of Socrates himself. So we know the oracle played a direct role in Greek politics and history. And 2, when you're confronted by conflicting evidence or differing versions of the same event, keep an open mind. But this does not save Herodotus from a biased acceptance of Athenian tradition. And number 3, autopsy and first-hand oral information are superior to stories at second-hand, whether written or oral. Now, this tends to sometimes take the naive form. I know, for I was there myself, and it often placed Herodotus at the mercy of vergers and guides in Egyptian temples. So what did Herodotus think about the gods? He had no problem retelling origin myths involving the gods taking place many centuries ago, like how Hercules peoples land in Scythia with a woman who is snaked from the waist down. But Herodotus refrains from claiming that the gods are active in the world today or in living memory. Now, believe it or not, archaeologists have actually discovered ancient Scythian images of a half-human, half-snake goddess-like figure in the archaeological record. J.B. Bury writes that Herodotus was in certain ways so lacking in common sense a part of his work might seem to have been written by a precocious child. He undertook to write the history of a great war, but he doesn't possess the most elementary knowledge of the conditions of warfare. His fantastic statements of the impossible numbers of the army of Xerxes exhibits an incompetence which is almost incredible, and is alone enough to stamp Herodotus as more of an epic poet than a historian. Perhaps Herodotus was aiming to be more of a epic poet, although working in prose, than an academic historian. We do know that Herodotus was the father of travelogue. The first 4 books review the culture and history of Persia, Scythia, and Egypt. Herodotus lacks the intellectual rigor of modern academic historians. Herodotus is more comparable to a modern movie producer. He wrote his books so they could be read at religious festivals and other public gatherings, and he wanted his books to be entertaining. So he includes many anecdotes, descriptions, and stories simply because they're interesting. As J.B. Bury notes, Herodotus has a wonderful flair for a good story, and the gracious garrulity with which he tells historical anecdotes is one of the charms which will secure him readers till the world's end. And Gibbon happily observes that Herodotus sometimes writes for children and sometimes writes for philosophers. What is more wonderful than the delightful story Herodotus retells of the Amazons, the fierce women warriors in Scythia? In the Scythian language, Amazon meant man-killer. They are forbidden to marry until they've killed an enemy in battle. And we know that even today, Gal Gadot more than keeps up with even Batman and Superman. And the Amazons in ancient Scythia were just as enticing and threatening. Like the Persians and Scythians both, they were skilled at horsemanship. When the Amazons invaded Scythia, Herodotus tells us that they made no further attempt to kill the traveling Amazons, but they sent a detachment of their youngest men, about equal in number, with orders to camp near them and take their cue from whatever it was that the Amazons did. If the Amazons pursued them, they were not to fight, but to give ground. When the pursuit was abandoned, they were once again to encamp nearby. The motive was the Scythians' desire to get children by the Amazons. and the Amazons, realizing the men meant no harm, ignored them, so that each day the two camps drew closer together. Neither party had anything but their weapons and their horses, and both lived by hunting and plundering. Now, during dinner and drinks, the ladies had to go off in ones and twos to diddle in the bushes, and some ran into young men diddling, and soon they were dallying, and then the Amazons brought their friends, and the camps united, and everybody was dallying, but the Amazon ladies did not want to settle down. So with the men, they jointly continued their hunting and raiding parties, living happily ever after if we believe Herodotus. And Herodotus discusses Egypt in the second book of his histories, providing both cultural background and the conquest of Egypt by the Persian king Cambyses. Now, did Herodotus visit Egypt personally, or did Herodotus merely copy the travelogues of Hecataeus or repeat eyewitness accounts of other Greeks who visited Egypt? His stories of Egypt are almost as fantastical as those stories about Scythia, and his inaccuracies regarding Egypt cause some scholars to wonder. Although his description of a crocodile suggests he actually saw a crocodile, he totally botches his description of a hippopotamus. The Greek word for a hippo was a river horse, and he repeats Hecataeus in describing what the term river horse would suggest: an animal that has 4 legs, cloven hoofs like an ox, a horse's mane and tail, conspicuous tusks, and a voice like a horse's neigh. My opinion is Herodotus did travel to Egypt. He recounts the Egyptian version of the story of the Trojan prince Paris, who abducted the already married Helen from the palace of King Menelaus. Herodotus could not have made up a story like this. The source must have been Egyptian. Although Herodotus does not retell them, the myths surrounding Helen of Troy would have been known to all Greeks, and we will retell them here, especially since they were a favorite of the painters, and they are very curious myths. In one myth, Helen was the daughter of the god Zeus and the mortal Leda. An eagle was chasing Zeus, who had taken on the form of a swan, and to escape the eagle, this divine swan sought refuge with Leda, and they enjoyed a mutual affection, and Leda laid an egg, and out of the egg hatched Helen, the daughter of Leda and the swan Zeus. When it was time for the beautiful Helen to marry, many of the Greek kings and princes wooed her, bringing her many gifts. Odysseus had the suitors promise that whoever won the hand of Helen, the others would defend the chosen husband against whoever would quarrel against them. After the suitors agreed, King Menelaus was chosen as her husband. So why did Paris abduct Helen? In this myth, Eris, the goddess of discord, throws a golden apple into a banquet held by Zeus, and the 3 goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, all claim the golden apple. They ask Zeus to say who among them was the fairest and most deserving of the apple. But Zeus stays out of it and delegates this unpleasant task, or maybe not so unpleasant, to Paris so he can judge between them. The 3 goddesses attempt to bribe Paris. Hera offers to make him king of Europe and Asia. Athena offers him wisdom and skill in war. But Aphrodite promises him the most beautiful woman in the world, and that would be Queen Helen. Now, Helen's already married, unfortunately, so Paris goes to visit the palace of King Menelaus, where he seduces and abducts Helen with the help of Aphrodite, as some versions of the myth suggest. In the Egyptian version of the story told to Herodotus, on his way back to Troy, the ship of Paris and Helen of Troy is driven to the Egyptian shore by bad weather. Some of his slaves seek refuge and tell the Egyptians how Paris had abducted Helen from her palace, and they are brought before King Proteus of Egypt, according to Herodotus. And Proteus upbraids Paris, "I should punish you for the sake of your Greek host, to be welcomed as a guest, and to repay that kindness by so foul a deed. You are a villain. You seduced your friend's wife, and if that were not enough, persuaded her to escape with you on the wings of passion you roused. But though I cannot punish a stranger with death, I will not allow you to take away your ill-gotten gains. I will keep this woman, Helen, and your treasure, until the Greeks to whom they belong chooses to come and fetch them." Now this story makes sense to Herodotus. Why else would the Trojans slog through a bloody war for a solid decade? If Helen were in Troy, they could simply give her back to the Greeks and tell them to go back to Greece. But then Homer could not have written the epic poem, the Iliad, with the many stories of Paris and Helen and their conflicted love, if Helen of Troy was instead Helen in Egypt. Herodotus tells us another humorous story about Queen Nitocris of Egypt. She inscribed on her tomb, "If any king of Babylon hereafter is short of money, let him open my tomb and take as much as he likes. But this must only be done in case of need. Whoever opens my tomb under any other circumstances will not benefit." Now, of course, King Darius of Persia opens the tomb, where he reads this inscription: "If you have not been insatiably greedy and eager to get money by despicable means, you would have never opened the tomb of the dead." Now, Herodotus fancied that Egypt was a source of Greek culture and religion because of its great antiquity. When the Greeks went back over a dozen generations to the time of the Trojan Wars, many of their Greek ancestors were descended from the gods. But the Egyptians claimed that they could go back hundreds of generations before they ran into the gods. Herodotus thought at the time that the pyramids were 2,000 years old, but actually they were several millennia older than that. The stories about Egypt and Scythia are fantastical and are of little use to history scholars. Scholars theorize that some Egyptian priest tour guides are pulling his leg in many of these stories, so we'll let you read more of these tall tales on your own. And what were the root causes of the Greco-Persian Wars? There was always tension between the Greeks in Europe and the Persians in Asia, especially among the Greek city-states under Persian rule on the western Mediterranean coast of Persia. Capturing concubines was part of the warrior culture of the Greek city-states and of the ancient world in general, as the Iliad itself is about how the honor of Odysseus is offended when Agamemnon seizes Briseis, which is the concubine Odysseus captured in battle. And he seizes Briseis because the god Apollo forces Agamemnon to release his concubine Chryseis to her father, who is a priest of Apollo. Now, students over the ages complain about how close these names are, but can't you just imagine what Agamemnon said to Odysseus? "Briseis, Chryseis, what's the difference?" Herodotus confirms this dark side of Greek life when he says, "Abducting young women, in the opinion of the Greek warriors, is not a lawful act, but it is stupid to make a fuss about avenging it. The only sensible thing is to take no notice, for it is obvious that no young woman allows herself to be abducted if she does not wish to be." As if she had a choice. Herodotus does not miss a chance to denigrate the Persians, as the Persians took the seizure of women lightly enough, but not the Greeks, who raised a large army, invaded Asia, and destroyed the empire of King Priam of Troy in the Trojan Wars. And Herodotus has many fantastic stories about women in strange lands. Herodotus says that the Babylonians share this custom with the Eneti in Illyria. In every village, once a year, all the girls of manageable age are gathered, while the men stand round them in a circle, and an auctioneer then calls out each one in turn to stand up and offers her for sale, beginning with the prettiest. And marriage was the object of the transaction. The rich men bid against each other for the prettiest girls, while the humbler folk, who had no use for good looks in a wife, were actually paid to take the ugly ones. How preposterous. This likely is less like history and more like gossip from the Greeks in Ionia about how barbaric the barbarian Persians were. Herodotus may have fooled the great German commentator on Deuteronomy, Gerhard von Rad. In his discussion on temple prostitution, he summarizes from Herodotus how Babylonian women offer themselves to sanctuaries in consequence of a vow. He references where Herodotus tells us about a shameful Babylonian custom, where every woman, rich and poor, must once in her life go and sit in the temple of Aphrodite and there give herself to a strange man. Once a woman has taken her seat, she is not allowed to go home until a man has thrown a silver coin into her lap and taken her outside to lie with her. After that, her duty to the goddess is discharged, and she may go home, after which it will be impossible to seduce her by any other offer, however large. And we can surmise from these stories that Herodotus is at his least reliable when he describes the love lives of barbarians. And Herodotus goes far back into history to ponder the source of the enmity between the Asians and the Greeks. Now, Croesus of Leda was the first Asian tyrant to conquer the Greek colonists in Ionia. He lost his kingdom both from his foolish hubris and by the fulfilling of a curse on Gyges for another act of hubris, his ancestor 5 generations back. And so we're going to tell the story of the curse first. Now, Gyges was the bodyguard for King Cambyses, and his story was a favorite among painters, and we shall see why. The king told Gyges, "It appears that you won't believe me when I tell you how lovely my wife is. Well, a man believes his eyes better than his ears. Contrive to see her naked." And to this, Gyges gave a cry of horror. "Master," he said, "what an improper suggestion. Do you tell me to look at the queen when she has no clothes on? No, no, when she takes off her clothes, she does away with her shame. Now, students of ancient history know what kings want, kings get. So the king hid Gyges behind the curtain to spy on his wife as she disrobed. And yes, the queen did notice, but she kept her anger to herself. She did not indicate to the king her observation. The queen had a plan to ease her shame. The next day she summoned for Gyges to appear. Now Gyges, there are two courses open to you. You may take your choice between them. You can either kill Cambyses and seize the throne with me as your wife, or you can die yourself on the spot, so that never again may your blind obedience to the king tempt you to see what you have no right to see. One of you must die, either my husband, the author of this wicked plot, or you, who have outraged propriety by seeing me naked. Wow, true love knows no bounds. This love triangle ensnares everyone in a web of hubris and deceptions. And so we'll go back to King Croesus, who was known for his fabulous wealth. Even today, we often say that someone is as rich as Croesus. History and archaeology reveal that Croesus was an early king who first learned how to melt down precious metals and strike them into coins, using metal from his rich mines in Leda, which is roughly the western half of Asia Minor or today's Turkey. We know the discussion in Herodotus between Solon and Croesus was chronologically impossible, but it is a discussion that should have happened. Now Solon was the famed lawgiver to Athens who, after his laws were put into place, traveled around the Mediterranean so his laws could not be amended. When Solon visited the court of King Croesus, the king asked Solon, "I have heard about your wisdom and how widely you have traveled in the pursuit of knowledge. I cannot resist my desire to ask you a question. Who is the happiest man you've ever seen?" The answer Croesus wanted to hear was that he was the happiest of men since he was so wealthy. Now Solon said that Tellus was the happiest man, because in battle he fought for his countrymen, routed the enemy, and died a brave man, and the Athenians paid him a high honor of a public funeral on the spot where he fell. Croesus did not pick up on the moral lesson, but thinking he might get the second prize, asked Solon, who is the next happiest person? Solon said that Cleobus and Biton were the next happiest of men. Their mother wanted to drive their ox cart to the festival at the temple of the goddess Hera. Now the oxen hadn't come in from the fields, so her two sons, Cleobus and Biton, dragged their mother in the cart for 6 miles to the temple. And the crowds crowed about how lucky their mother was to have 2 such fine, dedicated sons. And their mother, in sheer pleasure at how the public praised her sons, prayed in the temple to the goddess Hera to grant her sons the greatest blessing that can fall to mortal men. Now be careful what you pray for. Should the mother have prayed this prayer? Now Herodotus does not provide us her name, which says to us that perhaps her prayer was not a very good prayer. And Hera granted her wish. The 2 lads fell asleep in the temple, and that was the end of them, for they never woke again. And the Argives, considering them to be the best of men, had statues made of them which they sent to Delphi. Now in both these stories and also the Iliad, we are reminded that in a warrior culture like the Greek culture, you gain everlasting glory from the deeds you perform that are retold many times by future generations. But Croesus did not like this answer either. So then Solon tells Croesus, man is entirely a creature of chance. Great wealth can make a man no happier than moderate means, unless he has the luck to continue in prosperity to the very end. Many rich men have been unfortunate, and many with a modest competence have had good luck. Though the rich have the means to satisfy their appetites and to bear calamities, the poor, if they're lucky, are more likely to keep clear of trouble, and will have besides the blessings of a sound body, health, freedom from trouble, fine children, and good looks. Now if a favored man dies as he has lived, he may die happy, but until he is dead, keep the word happy in reserve. Until death he is not happy, but only lucky. And the man who dies a peaceful death is the man who is truly happy. Now Croesus may have died happy, but he did not die rich. Later he learned of a new king named Cyrus, who was expanding his territory to the east of Lydia. King Croesus decided to consult the oracle of Delphi. He was uncertain whether he should see if King Cyrus wanted to attack Lydia, or whether he should launch a preemptive strike against the young king. With his request, Croesus sent lavish gifts of solid gold with his query to the god Apollo at the oracle of Delphi. But King Croesus did not heed the inscription carved on the temple of Delphi, "Know thyself." He did not sufficiently ponder the response given by the oracle. If Croesus attacks the Persians, he will destroy a great empire. Having received what he thought was a favorable answer, he was greedy for more news, so he sent another query, asking if his reign would be a long one. Likewise, he did not ponder the meaning of the next response from the priestess of Apollo. When comes the day that a mule shall sit on the Median throne? Then tender-footed Lydian by pebbly Hermas, run and abide not, nor think it shame to be a coward. Now instead, Croesus interpreted this oracle's answer literally, and prepared to attack the young King Cyrus, since they would never set a mule on the throne of the Medes. That was just absurd. So King Croesus crossed the river Halys and attacked the kingdom of Cyrus. The two armies fought hard all day, the fight was even, and Cyrus withdrew. But after Croesus withdrew back over the Halys and released his mercenary forces, Cyrus followed the reduced forces of King Croesus and decisively defeated him. And Herodotus notes, the oracle was fulfilled. Croesus had destroyed a mighty empire, his own. Cyrus was the mule. Cyrus the Great was half Persian, half Mede, sitting on both thrones. And we will let you read the story why Cyrus spared his life, and how Croesus became a trusted advisor to King Cyrus the Great, since he gained in wisdom what he lost in wealth. Now, one moral lesson to learn from this incident is that when Croesus requests from Cyrus permission to reproach Apollo for his deceit, since Croesus thought that the Delphic oracle's advice to fight Cyrus was so misleading. Now, this frank request humored Cyrus, and when Croesus sent envoys to the oracle with his query, he instructed them to ask if it was the habit of the Greek gods to be ungrateful. And Croesus thought Apollo was ungrateful, as Herodotus lists at length the many gifts of gold and treasure Croesus shipped to Delphi. Croesus had donated a large chunk of his fortune to bribe the favor of Apollo and the gods. And the priestess of Apollo responded that the gods themselves could not escape destiny, a common theme of Greek mythology, as that even mighty Zeus had limited power to alter the judgment of the fates. And the oracle reminded him of the curse of Gyges, and the priestess informed Croesus that she did intervene to postpone Cyrus's invasion by 3 years, and reminded him that Apollo did save him from his funeral pyre, and he should have inquired further about whose empire he was going to destroy. And summing up these moral lessons, we conclude that we will have limited success when we try to bribe God, and that consultants we hire will often tell us what we want to hear, or at best provide their advice diplomatically. Here the Greek maxim written on the temple at Delphi, "Know thyself," counsels us to realize our own prejudices, so we can honestly evaluate the advice and counsel provided by our friends and acquaintances, by our pastors and counselors, by scriptures and the church teachings. And we must also note that when Croesus lost his wealth, the oracle could be more brutally honest. They were no longer under any compunction to tell him what he wanted to hear. And Herodotus also tells us about the birth and boyhood of Cyrus the Great, the ruler that many of the Greeks admired. Now, originally the Medes were the dominant kingdom. The Persians were conquered by the Medes. Herodotus says that the Mede king Astyages had a daughter called Mandane, and that he dreamed one night that she urinated in such enormous quantities that it filled his city and swamped the whole of Asia. When consulted, his wise magi were alarmed, and rather than marry her to a Mede prince, he married her to a safe Persian, Cambyses, of good family and quiet habits, so their child would not have holy royal blood flowing in its veins. After the wedding, King Astyages had a more alarming dream about his pregnant daughter. A vine grew from his daughter's private parts and spread over Asia. He consulted with his magi. The dream was clear. That child would grow up to be a usurper of his throne. So Astyages had to do something about that. After Cyrus was born, the king instructed his loyal steward, Harpagus, to take and kill the child. And in turn, Harpagus sent for the herdsman Mithridates, who knew a stretch of pasture in the mountains ranged by wild beasts, the most suitable for the task at hand. Now, who would want to expose a sweet child, our sweet Cyrus, to the beasts? Not Mithridates. His wife was worrying about her husband being summoned to the palace, while Mithridates was worrying about his wife heavy with child. And when he came home, she burst out crying, putting her arms around the legs of her husband, begging him not to expose the child, much like the inexperienced warriors did in the Iliad when they did not wish to be slaughtered on the battlefield. My own child, his wife said, was born today, born dead. Take the body and expose it, and let us bring up Mandani's son as our own. Then our dead baby will have a royal burial, and this live one will not be killed. Everybody wins. So how was Cyrus discovered? He was playing king with the other boys in the village near the palace, and the other boys selected Cyrus, king of the herdsmen, as king. One of the boys, son of a distinguished Mede, refused to do what the boy king, Cyrus, told him to do, so Cyrus beat him savagely with a whip. This Mede dad brought the boys before King Astyages, and you wonder, how could a king have time for such petty disputes? But anyway, this is the story. Now King Astyages gazed at Cyrus, but that was not his name then, and he asked, "Why have you, the son of a slave, the impudence to handle in this outrageous manner a boy whose father is my most distinguished subject?" "Master," little Cyrus replied, "there was nothing wrong in what I did to him. We boys in the village were playing our game, and they made me king, because they thought I was the best man to hold the office. The others obeyed my orders, but he did not. He took no notice of me until he was punished. That is what happened, and if I deserve to suffer for it, I am ready." And having the son of a herdsman speak like this was kind of shocking. And Herodotus tells us Astyages guessed who he was, for that was not the answer of a slave. Moreover, the boy's features resembled his own, and his age fit the date of the exposure. King Astyages welcomed his grandson with open arms. The Magi did not want to have the boy killed, so they said that Cyrus had already been king in his little game, and that even our regular prophecies are sometimes fulfilled in apparently small incidents, and dreams often work out in trivial ways. And as we know, kings do as they please, and the king told Harpagus there was no hard feelings. But the king was upset that his steward did not follow orders. The king was upset that he deceived him. So the king invited Harpagus and his son to a banquet, and they were separated, and the cook chopped up the son, roasting and boiling the meat. Herodotus tells us, dishes of mutton were placed in front of everyone else, but to Harpagus was served the flesh of his son. When Harpagus had eaten as much as he wished, King Astyages asked him if he had enjoyed his dinner. Harpagus said yes indeed, and then the servants brought in the boy's head, hands and feet in the covered dish, and stood by Harpagus' chair and told him to lift the lid and take what he fancied. And we use as our picture a similar story of St. John the Baptist, how the evil daughter of Herodias requested the head of St. John the Baptist be given to her on a platter. Now, quite possibly, the painter, Rubens, had the feast of Harpagus in mind when he painted the feast of Herod, because the Gospels do not say that the head of the saint was presented at a banquet. Harpagus kept his cool. When Astyages asked him what flesh he had eaten, Harpagus simply replied, "I know, my lord, may the king's will be done." Harpagus did not forget, however. Hubris always bodes ill. The Magi did advise that Cyrus be sent back to Cambyses' palace in Persia, where he was received with delight. After Cyrus had grown to be the bravest and most popular young man in Persia, Harpagus was conspiring with dissatisfied nobles, and sent Cyrus a note that now was the time. Cyrus threw a banquet for the army of Persia in a large field, and he spoke to them, "Take my advice and win your freedom. I am the man destined to undertake your liberation, and it is my belief that you are a match for the Medes in war as in everything else. It is the truth I tell you. Do not delay. Fling off the yoke of Astyages at once." Now when Astyages assembled his army, he cluelessly appointed Harpagus as commander-in-chief. Most of the army of the Medes defected to Cyrus, and there wasn't much of a fight. Later the Medes rebelled, and the Persians put down the rebellion. But Cyrus was not interested in revenge. Herodotus tells us that Cyrus treated Astyages with great respect and kept him at his court until he died, to keep an eye on him, of course. Now there was conflict between the Persians and the Greek cities in Ionia on the west coast of Asia Minor. These cities sent a delegation to Sparta asking for help, but the Spartans declined, instead dispatching a 50-oared galley to Ionia to warn Cyrus not to harm any Greek city or they would take action. And Cyrus asks some Greeks, "Who are these people? How could they dare to send him such a command?" And then Cyrus answered the Spartan herald, "I have never been afraid of men who have a special meeting place in the center of their city, where they swear this and that and cheat each other." His successors would learn that the mainland Greeks were of sterner stuff than the Ionian Greeks, and furthermore that the Spartans were not like the Athenians. Was this small incident a premonition about the future Greco-Persian Wars? Now his general Harpagus subdued the Greek cities of Ionia while Cyrus traveled with his army to the east where he conquered Babylon. And Herodotus tells us many grand stories about his battlefield exploits. But alas, there are few if any paintings of Cyrus conquering Babylon, although Herodotus spins many yarns about these conquests. So we will skip Babylon and leave those stories for you to read on your own. And as all kings must do, they must have an end, and Cyrus meets his end on the battlefield. And in the histories, Cyrus the Great loses his life when the armies of Queen Tomyris of the Massagetae defeats him in battle. They were a Scythian race at the far eastern end of the Persian Empire, east of the Caspian Sea, where many of the Russian Muslim republics are today. Cyrus first offered Tomyris his hand in marriage, but Herodotus notes he was met with a refusal, for the queen was well aware that he was wooing not her herself, but her dominions. Since these Scythians were nomads, not accustomed to the luxuries and delicacies the Persians enjoyed, his trusted advisor Croesus suggested a clever strategy. The Persians would set up a massive tempting banquet, guarded by his weakest troops, but withdraw and conceal the main force. And sure enough, a third of the Massagetae army, commanded by the son of Tomyris, Spargapises, massacred this rump force, and at once took their seats and began to regale themselves, and ate and drank so much that they fell asleep, and then they were massacred by the main Persian force. And this treachery infuriated our nomad queen, and her army won after many hours of close fighting with bows and arrows and spears and daggers, overwhelming and destroying the Persian army. Herodotus tells us, after the battle, Tomyris ordered a search to be made amongst the Persian dead for the body of Cyrus. And when found, she pushed the head into a skin which she had filled with human blood, and cried out as she committed this outrage, "Although I have conquered you and live, yet you have ruined me by treacherously taking my son. See now, I fulfill my threat. You have your fill of blood." Now Xenophon, who also wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War, picking up where Thucydides left off, also wrote a history of Cyrus the Great. In his version, Cyrus the Great died peacefully in his sleep. However, archaeologists and modern historians debate many of the details in both of these histories. Now Herodotus leaves out completely in his history the incident that is so important to Jews and Christians. After he conquered Babylon, King Cyrus allowed the Jews and other conquered peoples who were forcibly removed to Babylon to return home to their native land. Cyrus the Great even helped fund the rebuilding of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And after this, Herodotus discusses King Cambyses, conqueror of Egypt. In Herodotus, before his last battle, Cyrus dreamed that Darius would take over his throne. Herodotus says this dream did not reveal treachery as Cyrus thought, but was instead a prophecy that Cyrus would soon lose his throne. Consequently, Cyrus sent his son Cambyses with his trusted advisor Croesus back to Persia, so they survived. Cambyses conquered much of Egypt for Persia, which Herodotus describes in Book 2. Herodotus views Cambyses as being half mad, cruel, and insolent, and committing acts of arrogance and hubris, like sending his army on campaigns crossing the desert without adequate supplies. There are many stories about Cambyses in Book 2 of the Histories that covers Egypt. He rules for only 8 years. Herodotus says his death was brought about by an act of hubris when he stabbed the sacred Apis bull, causing its death. Cambyses was succeeded by his brother Smerdis per Herodotus, and Smerdis in Greek is also Bardaia in Persian, and he ruled for only a few months before he was overthrown by conspirators led by King Darius, who is also mentioned in several books of the Old Testament. And one of the most notable and unlikely debates in the histories occur between the conspirators, who include Darius. Unlikely because they're debating which form of government is superior, a democracy, an oligarchy, or a monarchy. How many conspirators keep notes of their secret discussions, and if they did, would they share them with Herodotus? This is clearly a Greek debate inserted to the mouths of the Persian conspirators. Herodotus himself acknowledges that many of the audience will not believe they occurred. Since King Darius would be an absolute monarch, we know that this argument supporting monarchy will be the final word. But the debate opens with the assertion that monarchy is neither pleasant nor good. And Herodotus says, the typical vices of a monarch are envy and pride, envy because it is a natural human weakness, and pride because excessive wealth and power leads to the delusion that he is something more than a man. These two vices are the root causes of all wickedness. Both lead to acts of savage and unnatural violence. But under a democracy, under a government of the people, a magistrate is appointed by lot and is held responsible for his conduct in office, and all questions are put up for debate. But in favor of an oligarchy, the masses are a feckless lot. Nowhere will you find more ignorance or irresponsibility or violence. It would be an intolerable thing to escape the murderous caprice of a king, only to be caught up by the equally wanton brutality of a mob. The masses handle affairs without thought. All they can do is rush blindly into politics like a river in a flood. In the closing speech, Darius favors monarchy. One ruler, it is impossible to improve upon that, provided he is the best. In an oligarchy, the men competing for distinction leads to personal feuds, which can lead to civil wars and bloodshed. And in democracies, admiration of the mob for a ruler often results in absolute rule. And in his closing argument, which argues that we should preserve the monarchy, we should refrain from changing ancient ways, which have served us well in the past. Darius the Great would preside over the Persian Empire at its greatest extent, and he would lead the first failed expedition to conquer mainland Greece after subduing the restless Greeks in Ionia on its western shores. He would find the mainland Greeks to be more resolute and determined than the Greeks in Ionia, which he would learn when he invades Greece and is defeated. And his son Xerxes would learn this lesson again when he raises another massive army and navy and is defeated again by the brave and determined and disciplined Greeks. And Aeschylus also gives us what is perhaps an eyewitness account of the complete defeat of the more numerous Persian navy in the Battle of Salamis. And now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. Although this is a rather long video, there are many delightful stories that Herodotus spins that we didn't include. You may want to skip directly to Book 5 or Book 6 to read first his account of the Greco-Persian Wars. Historians agree that much of the background stories in the first 4 books on Persia, Egypt, and Scythia is fanciful, legendary, or mythological, especially the book on Egypt. If you want to skip around in your reading of the first 4 books, you can consult the outline on Dr. Wikipedia's article on the history. We recommend this Penguin Classics edition for the footnotes. We cannot imagine trying to read Herodotus without footnotes. And we highly recommend this collection of Yale classroom essays of the ancient Greek historians by Professor Berry. Although they were compiled in 1909, they remain very timely today. We also highly recommend the great courses by Professor Van Diver. The first half-dozen lectures provide excellent background on ancient Greek history up to the time of Herodotus. Most of her lectures are a consensus of scholarly opinion, as we see the themes in her lectures repeated in many other lectures on ancient Greece. And the great courses on the Greek-Persian Wars by Professor Hale also provide interesting archaeological evidence used by modern historians to add to and correct the classic literary evidence that's our primary source. Especially interesting is his lecture on Persia, where he describes how, in the late 1800s, Henry Rawlinson, a young British East India officer, deciphered the Behushtan cuneiform inscription found carved into a mountainside in what is now central Iran. This is a royal decree early in the reign of King Darius announcing the triumphs in securing the throne. The carvers chiseled away the stairs, providing easy access to the inscriptions, so future kings would find it more difficult to chisel away the cuneiform messages. The YouTube description links to the video script and our blog. Please support our channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons, and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. And please click on the links for interesting videos on other topics that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.